I'm Mike Davis. I'm from Global Witness, which is an organization which does quite a lot of work on this theme of corruption and money laundering, which we're going to talk about this afternoon. To introduce the session a little bit, give it a bit of context, corruption is an issue which is as old as the hills, but the notion of a globalized industry specializing in facilitating corruption is a relatively new phenomenon, and one which has become particularly prevalent with the onset of globalization. And this results in situations where you have very clever, very over-educated professionals in parts of the world like this one who are facilitating corruption around the world, often to the detriment of people who were very poor and lacking in power in the first place. Now, until only a few years ago, and those of you who've worked on these issues for some time will be familiar with this, there was a sort of a strange taboo in terms of even talking about corruption. And if you spent any time working in countries which suffered from this, you would find that the discourse was often framed by well-meaning people from donor governments or perhaps the likes of the World Bank in terms of patronage and rent-seeking and other sort of cotton wool-infused terms like that. And it's a relatively recent thing that people have begun to talk about this issue in the round and the internationalized dimensions of it. And one of the reasons that that's begun to change is really because the problem is so immense that it's impossible to ignore. And there are many case studies, I dare say many of them have already been showcased today, which illustrate this, but a pretty good one which remains in the news at the moment is the 1MDB case in Malaysia, where you had a globalized scheme which has robbed Malaysia of, depending on which estimate you pick, $4.5 billion or $7 billion, run through a series of shell companies and offshore facilitators. Now, the second reason it's begun to change is because of work done by very committed activists and politicians to shine a light on the problem and tackle it. And we're very fortunate to have three of those people with us today who are going to give our presentations. So to introduce them briefly, first of all, we're going to hear from MEP Ana Gomes. Can I still call you an MEP? Sorry, ex-MEP since yesterday?
Since today.
Oh, since today, sorry. Now, Ana has been a career diplomat. Amongst other things, she was the Portuguese ambassador in Indonesia during the period that Timor-Leste gained its independence between 1999 and 2003, and she's held a range of other positions as well. She then suspended her international career to go into politics, and she's been a member of the European Parliament for the Portuguese Socialist Party and the European Socialist Party up until today. Now, in her role in the European Parliament, I think many of us have benefited from her passion and her expertise. She has driven forward agendas to do with human rights, security and defense, international relations, migration, taxation, and of course financial crimes. And in the presentation which she's going to give us, she's going to talk about particularly the phenomenon known as golden visas, which is a snappier term for the more official nomenclature of investment visas, investment schemes, which is something which caught on in the Caribbean some years ago, but is now sort of transferred over to Europe, where there's a string of these schemes being run, including in this country and used by people like the energetic Harrods shopper, Zamira Hedjieva. And so Anna's going to talk us through some of the issues to do with golden visas, the risks that they bring, and what can be done. We're then going to hear from Dame Margaret Hodge, who's been a Labour MP in the UK since 1994, and she's served in government. She's held a range of government portfolios, and she's also played some very significant parliamentary roles, notably as chair of the Public Accounts Committee, of which she was the first female chair, and her current role as chair of the all-party parliamentary group on responsible tax. And she is going to talk to us about the work which she has done with colleagues of hers on both sides of the political aisle to force greater transparency by UK overseas dependencies, so the overseas territories as they're known, and also more recently the Crown Dependencies. And this is about the scourge of shell companies, anonymous companies, the vehicles for all sorts of corruption and money laundering related crimes that we see globally. And she's going to talk us through the work that she's done there and what still needs to be done. And then we're going to hear from Duncan Hames. Duncan is the Director of Policy at Transparency International UK. And what he's doing is spearheading work which is designed to end the UK's status as a safe haven for corrupt money and also addressing corruption in politics. And this also extends to advancing global standards in, for instance, the issue of beneficial ownership, anonymous companies, which I just mentioned. And Duncan, prior to this, worked on information security with Templar executives, and he also currently serves on the board of the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust, where as Senior Independent Director he chairs the Audit Committee. And in his presentation, Duncan is going to talk to us about some of the main weaknesses in the UK anti-money laundering defences. I think he's going to home in on the issue of corporate liability laws and the difficulty of getting convictions for firms involved in money laundering, as well as beneficial ownership, the UK Beneficial Ownership Registry, and also the failings on the part of professional bodies that are supposed to be a key part of the UK's efforts to stop money laundering. And this is a particularly important set of themes given that, as we know, there's political developments afoot both in terms of the shenanigans in the Tory party and also Brexit, which could make the challenge of holding the line and addressing money laundering in the UK that much harder very soon. Now, once we've heard the presentations, and we're going to hear them back to back with no breaks in between, we're going to turn to questions. I'm very new to this exciting system called Slido, which captures questions from all of you in the room via your phones, and I hope you know how to use this by now because I'm not at all qualified to explain to you how it works, and also people who are tuning in externally. But when we get to that point, I'm also going to ask for a quick show of hands from those who will want to raise their hands and ask questions in a more conventional way. And if there are any of those of you in the room who want to do it that way, that's going to make my job much more complicated, but that's absolutely fine, obviously. So the speakers are going to talk to us for 10 minutes each, and I'm going to hand over first to Ana Gomes.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's quite exciting to be living 15 years as an MEP and to be here with people interested in fighting corruption and in fighting tax fraud, tax crimes, and money laundering. That's exactly what I intend to do in my life after Parliament. I've been one of the people focusing on the golden visas because I saw it coming in my country, Portugal. You know, when at the peak of the crisis, when we were under the so-called Troika, supposedly under maximum supervision, well, everything happened. Horrendous privatizations with all sorts of schemes, tax amnesties, even a tax and anti-money laundering blackout. Nobody knew about the aggregated figures of what was being siphoned abroad, no controls during those years of the Troika. And that's when the golden visas was invented because we needed money. We were not really inventing the wheel. We were just copying what others in the EU were doing. And of course, it smacked of fostering corruption from day one. It was a hell of a fight to have the European Commission get involved and realize this had to be seen at the European level. It started with the outrage when Cyprus, another country under tremendous duress during these years where we were called pigs, Cyprus started selling directly passports, selling nationality. The same with Malta. The Commission would say, well, we can't do anything. This is the ultimate realm of national sovereignty. It's about citizenship. But we were saying, no, it's not just about citizenship. Indeed, it has tremendous implications of citizenship to all the European Union member states. It's not by chance that the companies that are selling these schemes actually sell it. I mean, you go to Malta, you on the flight, you get the flight magazine, and you see the advertising, and actually say it's about EU traveling throughout the EU, residence and citizenship in the EU. And of course, this had tremendous other implications. Well, the Commission resisted until we were able to indeed make the point that this had tremendous implications in terms of tax evasion and money laundering, and indeed security, namely security of the Schengen zone, because obviously it's the Schengen area, which is extremely attractive to everybody who wants, I mean, any kleptocrat of this world wants to put their money safe. Of course, the best place to where to put it safe and to clean it is in the Schengen area. It took a lot of time, therefore, many years, until and after we passed the fourth anti-money laundering, based on, indeed, the cases of corruption that came up in Portugal that showed that corruption was going to the head of the state institutions, including a minister of Home Affairs who had to resign and went to court, that the Commission got in and realized that, indeed, it could be argued. Taxation, by the way, is another area which is not EU competence. Again, another ultimate national sovereignty realm. But in the same way as the Commission managed to find a European angle to go after, for instance, after Ireland, to go and collect the money that it had saved from Apple with the tax rulings, through the state aid, if you are indeed giving benefits to companies or to people of any sort, you are benefiting them illegally. And through that angle, the Commission got in. And the Commission put out, finally, a report this year, which was based in their own investigation with all the member states. In January, I recommend that you go Google it. It's easy to Google it, European Commission golden visas schemes. And the Commission concluded, which is amazing, we didn't realize that there were 3 member states who were directly selling the citizenship, Bulgaria, Cyprus, and Malta, and there were 20 member states that were selling the resident schemes, some in more perverse ways than others, and more easy ways than others. And of course, there are companies, enablers, in the middle of that. Some companies, a major company, for instance, is this Hanley and Partners group that have a connected think tank called talking about immigration. Of course, they talk about immigration for global citizens, and they are, for instance, the ones that sold the citizenship of St. Kitts and Nevis to an Iranian guy that got a license in 2013 in Malta to operate a bank, now closed, Pilatus Bank, and that is at the origin of a big scandal that involved even the murder, the assassination of journalist Daphne Caruana Galicia, who denounced all that, including the way that was capturing government. I mean, you have the Prime Minister of Malta going on road shows, bound by contract with this company, Hanley and Partners, to actually promote the golden visa schemes, be it passport or residency. You have a competing group called Arten Group, where, for instance, the former president of the Commission, Mr. Durão Barroso, was one of the guest speakers, talking about migration. The guys have no shame, and they speak about migration, regulating migration, when, of course, we are talking about big, rich kleptocrats and bringing their money into the EU. And they say that their main competitors are actually the big 4. In this business. In Portugal, before I get to Portugal, let me tell you, the Commission concluded in this report that the risks are systemic, that indeed they have tremendous impact for the security of the European Union, namely of the Schengen area. They have tremendous implications as well in money laundering, in tax evasion, and also in the importation of all sorts of criminality. And of course, as it was said, it's a major facilitator of corruption in our own countries and in national institutions, and of course, an enabler of kleptocracy from all over the world. It's not by chance that the money that Cyprus invests in Russia that Cyprus is a main investor in Russia, and of course, this is part of the laundromat scheme. In Portugal, it's one of the countries where the system is quite perverse, but it's been outrageously defended by the socialist government of my own party, as it was enacted by the right-wing government during the Troika. And it's very nasty because it's totally opaque. No one, not even me, who have often, as an MEP, asked to see the lists of the people, have been given access to that. And it is only because they know I would find a lot of crooks. This system has been operating since 2012, end of 2012. And it now, according to the latest figures, they show 7,465 authorizations of residence in Portugal. We're not selling directly passports, we're selling them by installments, because after 5 years of having an investment authorization for a residence permit, you can actually get the national passport. And of course, together with them come 12,746 people as family reunification. The due diligence about all these people, ridiculous, none. They say the banks do it. The banks don't do it, and nobody else does it, even less real estate agents. The state doesn't do it. And of course, it's not by chance that the majority of these the nationalities that are using this are Chinese, 4,246, then Brazilian, 740. I was speaking to some Brazilian friends here and saying, of course, Brazilians don't need this to buy this to come to Portugal and reside in Portugal because of our links and our arrangements. They do it to wash the money, to bring the money and to launder it. Turkey, South Africa, and Russia, of course, and many more. Total opacity, total protection. They use actually data protection perversely to not disclose even to me as an MEP. It's quite outrageous. And of course, the reason being, we need money. They say more than 4 billion have been invested in the country, but not in the state. Of course, this is mostly in real estate, in property, skyrocketing the prices in segments of the country with tremendous consequences, gentrification of our cities and so on. And actually, the authorizations that have been given, because they could be given to create at least jobs, a business that would create at least 10 jobs, it's only 15 out of these 7,000 in 6 years, basically. It's quite significant, this. And of course, so the economic interest for the country is ridiculous. I would just end telling you that this is indeed extremely perverse. We have seen through the scandals, for instance, in the ABLV scandal in Latvia, money laundering in Latvia, or via the Danske Bank, the Estonian branch of Danske Bank. It was people, for instance, with these kind of passports from Malta and other countries who were the enablers of the schemes for money laundering in these other European countries. The dangers are tremendous for our security. I do not even mention the immorality of giving golden visas, of selling golden visas. In Portugal, 500,000 to buy property, or even less, 350,000 for cultural gift or something like that. Anything goes. But while at the same time making life terrible for genuine refugees and for migrants who, of course, are needed very much in the EU. It's really horrendous what is going on, and the level of hypocrisy, even of socialist. My socialist party is tremendous, and it's really one reason why we need to really focus on this and act.
Do we need to use that?
Not really. If you want to go ahead, Margaret.
Unless nobody can hear.
You might. Sorry, you will need the microphone.
I've got the microphone.
You're hooked up. Okay.
Yeah, I've got a mic. Okay, it's the mic. Sorry. I'm just hopeless. Shall I start? Thank you. Well, I want to start by saying a big thank you to lots of the civil society organisations that are here, because I think between us, working in partnership, you and us in Parliament, we are beginning to have some really strong wins, and neither of us would have had it alone. So I'm going to start with a big thank you, and a thank you to Tax Justice Network as well. I And, you know, we've got to, the other thing I very much feel is when we started on this journey, nobody talked about tax. It was always seen as being the private concern of a group of professionals, far too complicated for the rest of us to get our minds around. And now it is brilliant that actually tax and tax justice and who pays and how much they pay is part of the overall agenda, whether you're in a pub or whether you're at a dinner table. So I think that is a great, great win for all of us, and we've got to keep that going. My personal journey on this, I never thought I'd be involved in tax issues. I'd sort of, because I was one of those who thought it was all just far too technical and complicated. My personal journey started when I chaired the Public Accounts Committee. And two little stories, because I want to get on to serious stuff, but two little stories. David Davis, who had been the previous, of Brexit fame, who'd been the previous chair of the Public Accounts Committee, came up to me and poked me in the chest. He said, "I'll give you all the help I can, Margaret." So I said, "Thank you very much." And then he said, "Vodafone. You've got to look at the tax affairs of Vodafone." And I couldn't for the life of me understand how the tax affairs of a private company had anything to do with a parliamentary committee that was tasked with looking at how public spend its money. And the real importance, it came to me very quickly, is of course the collecting money goes to the heart of the efficiency of HMRC. So it very, very much came into what we were doing. And the other story, I'm endless with stories, but the other thing was that we had one of these really boring sessions with HMRC where we were holding it to account, and I had a very big, thick document, a worthy document that had been prepared by the National Audit Office. And I read it on the Sunday night for a Monday hearing and thought, this is so tedious. And then I just happened to look at that week's Private Eye. And Private Eye was running a story about the sweetheart deal on Goldman Sachs. And that gave us the basis for starting the questioning and starting us on our journey. But when I started, it was about tax avoidance. It was about really aggressive tax avoidance and a little bit of tax evasion. And what is so interesting, this is now sort of 6-7 years ago, what is so interesting is how very quickly you move in that spectrum from tax avoidance through to tax evasion, through to money laundering and economic crime. And it is a spectrum. And today I spend much more of my time around the issues of economic crime than I do around sort of aggressive tax avoidance, important though that is. And I think the thing that has shocked me personally as I've got deeper into the issue is how Britain, and this is a rather British sort of perspective on it, has become the jurisdiction of choice for so much of the dirty money around the world. And the reason for that is partly that we've got such a weak regulatory framework, down to both the Labour government and to the Conservative government and coalition government and Conservative government following it. You know, we wanted to attract business through a very weak regulatory and wealth through a very weak regulatory framework. Partly because we've got a mess in terms of the policing of the system, too many agencies, all of which are far too weak and under-resourced to actually, within that weak regulatory framework, do a good job. And then the third element, which is what I'm going to talk about, is also our association with some of the biggest tax havens in the world in our overseas territories and our Crown Dependencies. And the figures are gobsmacking. In the National Crime Agency, and I bet it's a really conservative figure, I bet you Richard Murphy would have a much bigger figure than this, says it's £90 billion a year of dirty money that finds its way into the UK. That is a heck of a lot of that. We know the figures around developing countries, that they lose 3 times as much in tax avoidance and money laundering than they get in international aid. That is a terrible, terrible statistic that none of us ought to live with. And we know that from the work that Gabriel Zuckman has done, that there's probably getting on for $8 trillion worth of money held offshore. And Britain's role in this is enormous. If you look at the Panama Papers, over half of the entities that were cited in the Panama Papers were of entities that were located and registered in just one of our tax havens, and that's the British Virgin Isles. If you look at the Metropolitan Police's investigation of corruption involving properties, 75% of those properties where there's corruption involved are again anonymous corporate entities. A third of those are registered in the Crown Dependencies, who constantly tell us they do good things. So whatever stat you look at, Britain is always at the heart of a lot of the corruption, and particularly through the jurisdictions which are part of the British family. So it was pretty obvious to me, and it's pretty obvious to all of you, that one of the key tools that would help us fight corruption, fight money laundering, fight tax evasion and tax avoidance is transparency. And fighting for transparency right across the system has become the focus of the all-party group that I now chair. And I just want to talk about it a bit, because it is very interesting. In the current climate, where there is not a majority in Parliament, the way in which you can achieve change is by working across parties. And when I started this work, I thought, we're never going to get anywhere. But indeed, my latest bestest friend is Andrew Mitchell, although I'm a bit worried about his support for Boris Johnson. But he and I have worked together very, very effectively since 2015. And when we started, we thought the first thing we'd do is try and force on the overseas territories public registers of beneficial ownership. We got Cameron on board, we got George Osborne on board. The UK itself has produced an open register of beneficial ownership, very poor in quality, very badly policed, but nevertheless we've gone through that first step. And we thought this was, and the government, although it was warm words about public registers, was not actually implementing it across the overseas territories and across the Crown Dependencies. So we thought we'd take on the overseas territories argument first. People told us to stay clear of the Crown Dependencies at that point because of their different constitutional settlement. And I did a very interesting exercise in that I talked one-to-one to 60 Conservative MPs. Got to know some of them better than I do some of my Labour colleagues. And they were all people that Andrew suggested to me, and then one led to another to another. And it was a bit, I mean, they're full of funny stories. I had one Tory MP, I will tell you a couple of them. One Tory MP who I thought would be a waste of time. And he came into the room, and we started chatting. And then I got him talking about transparency in the overseas territories. And he said to me, trouble is, Margaret, I've got a lot of friends, and they're very rich. And they don't want to tell their wives how much money they've got. So I got absolutely nowhere with him. But then I had another guy who came in, and I looked up his CV, and I thought, I don't agree with a thing with this guy. He's anti-Europe, he's anti any gay rights, he was anti-abortion, absolutely. There was no value system at all that we shared. But then I saw that he was also anti-Russian. So I talked to him about the money that was coming in, the £68 billion that Russia had invested in the overseas territories over a 10-year period. I talked to him about the fact 7 times as much money flowed into the overseas territories than flowed into the UK. And surprise, surprise, he became one of my staunchest supporters. So it was a very interesting exercise. But I think the other thing to say about it, which I think is important, is what I realised, and I hadn't realised before, despite all my years in politics, is that I always thought Labour was the only people who wanted to change the world, and the Conservatives didn't. Actually, we all want to change the world. And for many people, the reason you end up in a tribe, particularly in our two-party system, because it sort of means they're both broad churches, the reason you end up in a tribe may be the oddest of reasons, where you live, what your parents voted for. And just because you're in a particular tribe doesn't necessarily mean that you hold particular views or that you won't support particular legislation. And that's been really important to us. So we ended up, with God knows how many Tories willing to support us, and a lot of leading Tory campaigners also there. I have to say, I had to get, I'm not the world's favorite with my own whips for the work I'm doing around things like anti-Semitism. So I was worried about getting all the Labour vote out on the day that we had the Overseas Territories Amendment. So Andrew Mitchell, who is an ex-chief whip, went into my chief whip and said, you dare have one vote missing on that day, and I'll make sure that you get the blame if we don't get the amendment through. And that was quite interesting. And I also remember on the very day, one of the leading Conservatives who'd said he was going to support us wobbled on the day. So I literally got into the House of Commons, marched into his room, interrupted his meeting and said, you can't let us down, and managed to get him back on board again. So it was a very good exercise. And we got it through. In fact, the government had to concede, and we are now on train to have transparency in our overseas territories. With a sleight of hand, the government has changed what we did in our amendment, and we're determined to change it back again. Europe, through the Money Laundering Directive, is going to bring in the change by the end of 2019, although I'm interested to see whether they'll meet that date. We thought we'd give the overseas territories an extra year till the end of 2020 because we got representations on the impact of the hurricanes, particularly on places like the BVI, and it was a bit much to, therefore, that they had to cope with that in the first instance, and we felt they deserved a further year. What emerged a few months ago was, through a sleight of hand, they're now talking about an implementation date of 2023. So we want to do that. I then want to talk about the Crown Dependencies, and then just a tiny bit about what we're going to do next. So we've got the overseas territories, and we are really pleased about that, but the Crown Dependencies, who claim that they aren't the home for any dirty money whatsoever, and that there is absolutely no tax avoidance evasion that takes place using those jurisdictions, were outside our amendment. So Andrew Mitchell and I did royal visits to the 3 Crown Dependencies. We went and visited all 3 of them. They're tiny little jurisdictions with populations of, under 100,000. And really what you pick up from these jurisdictions is the power of the financial services industry there. They really run the show, and the legislation and everything comes actually, in my view, I hope others will agree with me in the room who know them better, that it comes very much, the financial services industry rules the roost. We did the visit. We said we meant business. We were going to ensure that we had transparency in the Crown Dependencies as well. We were supported by one charity in getting a legal opinion which overcame this sort of constitutional argument. Did you have the power to intervene constitutional in the Crown Dependencies? And we do. I mean, the great example is Radio Caroline, actually, ironically, because when Radio Caroline started transmitting from Isle of Man, from the Isle of Man, that created chaos in all the airwaves, and the British government passed legislation preventing the transmission of anything on the airwaves. This was in the 1960s, but it gave us, from the Isle of Man, from the Crown Dependency, it gave us an example of where the UK government had intervened in the Crown Dependencies to legislate. But we got an extremely good legal opinion. And then a couple of weeks back, to our great surprise, we did another thing. We had found a bill, one of the endless Brexit bills, where we could insert a relevant clause, which would have compelled the Crown Dependencies to have public registers of beneficial ownership. The government pulled that legislation on the morning that it was to be considered by the House, because they knew that they would lose that particular clause. And then finally, a couple of weeks ago, the 3 Crown Dependencies came to see Andrew and I, and have said that they will now implement public registers of beneficial ownership by the end of 2023. This is another great victory, but we're not there yet, and we're worried that they really mean it, that there may be too many caveats in there, that they will do it in a way that really make sure that the registers are open so that, you know, they're free to access, so civil society and the press and any other group can get at it, and that also the data will be presented in a way that is easily accessible to anybody who shows an interest. So we will take this further, but it is seen as a great victory. So really, if we can park that and try and get the date forward, we think 2023 is too long. There are plenty of other things to do, and these are issues that we're now looking at around transparency. We haven't covered trusts yet. We need to do that. We are very anxious about transparency in property ownership, where the government has been promising legislation but has not actually come forward with the details to enable that to happen properly. But a lot of money is laundered into the UK through the property market, particularly in London. And the most astounding fact to me there is that Kensington and Chelsea is the only borough in London where over the last 10 years, the electorate has not gone up as it has elsewhere in London. It's gone up something like 3% elsewhere in the capital. It's gone down in Kensington and Chelsea. And the explanation for that is that so much property is owned by shell companies located in tax havens that it's not real people who will then exercise their right to vote. So we need to get that property. Country by country reporting is still not a reality here in the UK, and we need to work hard at trying to get that. That, I think, is a really uphill struggle. And we, in the all-party group on responsible tax, are now turning our minds to two issues. One is that we want greater transparency from our tax authorities, HMRC. They are a non-ministerial department. They operate in total secrecy. They hide behind taxpayer confidentiality so that you can never see whether a sweetheart deal has been done between George Osborne and Google, for example, or indeed whether everybody is paying the right amount of tax. So we are looking at some options and hope to come forward actually before the end of July with a paper suggesting some radical options which we can then take through, hopefully across cross-party alliance in Parliament. And then we also want to look at advisors, because it, you know, I think shared in this room, what is so outrageous about this is the corporations and the high net worth individuals. They're culpable in that they do avoid their moral responsibility to pay tax, but they are advised, particularly by the Big Four, who are still totally unaccountable for the actions they take and the advice they give. And turning to that and trying to look at how we can better regulate their role and hold them properly to public account will be our next move. Thank you.
Just jump in for a sec. We got some good questions coming through on Slido. Please keep them coming and have a look at what's up there. You can vote and elevate your favourites to the top. Now over to Duncan to talk about the UK as a money laundering hub and weaknesses in the anti-money laundering system.
Thank you, Mike. And it's certainly a pleasure for me to be here speaking on behalf of Transparency International UK this afternoon. Not least because, I dare say, some of you have been working very hard on these issues of tax abuse. Might be wondering, I thought Transparency International don't do tax. And indeed, it is a mantra that I have heard from time to time in our offices. And it's not without its use, I should confess, whether in terms of being able to focus on our chosen message, or indeed keep the door open in audiences where we're seeking to target our advocacy. Just as I dare say it was of use when Alistair Campbell used to say of Tony Blair, we don't do God. And perhaps no more accurate, given that in working closely with Margaret and in others, we're really well aware, in fact, it was described in this way at a recent global meeting of TI, that tax abuse and corruption are two sides of the same coin. And it's some of these same technical and legal devices that are used and exploited in order that people can get away with corruption, that are also central to some of the challenges that many of you have been working on in relation to tax abuse. So this afternoon we get to talk about money laundering, and as Margaret said, the UK has a big problem. The UK has a £100 billion a year problem with dirty money impacting the UK. That's not according to me or Transparency International, that's according to the National Crime Agency and indeed the government's most recent national risk assessment on illicit finance here. And yet at the same time, the government is very proud of its recent evaluation by the Multinational Financial Action Task Force. And this is, believe it or not, their most favourable assessment to date. So we have a bit of a paradox to work through here in terms of how a problem of this size can be met with a response which is being given such plaudits. And I think it comes down to measures which are being recognised as good measures, but which aren't being assessed for their effectiveness in practice. And maybe that's a matter of time, but our assessment is that there are some fundamental weaknesses in these, which I will outline. Indeed, the Financial Action Task Force themselves identified some particular challenges. The way we would frame these, to help you remember them, is ensuring that criminals have nowhere to hide their wealth, no one to help them do it, and no impunity for their crimes or for those that assist them. I would say no getting away with it. So there are key solutions for addressing each of those challenges. For nowhere to hide, we've been working for some years now on company beneficial ownership transparency. And you've already heard a lot from Margaret about the progress that we've been making here in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has some global leadership in this respect. The Persons of Significant Control Register at Companies House for UK limited companies is the first of its kind, freely available for anyone to inspect those people who are really behind the companies registered in the United Kingdom. But as the Financial Action Task Force observed in its review, some of the information in that register is inaccurate, as Margaret says, because it's unverified. And the reason it's not verified is because Companies House, as things currently stand, does not have a power to verify that information, to check for the accuracy of this information. And that's partly down to a history of the kind of role that Companies House played in the regulation of our business sector. But it's something which I've been arguing, including at Parliament Select Committees, really needs to change. I think there is a recognition now inside the relevant government department, the business department, that they need to reform the way they run these registries. And there's a consultation out at the moment on that, and I'd encourage those of you with an interest in this to take part in that consultation so that we might get the quality of register and the level of accuracy of data in that register that we need for this particular fight. We've done our own research at Transparency International UK. Last year we found 766 UK companies that had been involved in major corruption and money laundering schemes, which had amounted to about the schemes themselves amounted to about £80 billion worth of dirty money, much of it stolen from the populations of former Soviet countries through the laundromats that have blighted them. But it's not just our property register, it's not just our company register where transparency can help. We want to see a register of who really owns the companies, wherever they're registered, that own property, own real estate here in our country. If part of the land that we stand on, the buildings we see around us, are owned by a company, then just because that company is registered somewhere else in the world shouldn't prevent us from knowing who really owns that company. And the good news is that the British government has committed to doing this since the London Anti-Corruption Summit 3 years ago now. The bad news is, although they committed to introduce the necessary legislation for that register, they'd committed to do that by this time last year, and it hasn't happened yet. A draft bill has been produced, the civil servants have done their work, and that has been subjected to pre-legislative scrutiny from both houses of Parliament. And the MPs and the members of the House of Lords have done their job, and they've given a green light to this legislation and urged that it should be introduced as soon as possible. So there is cross-party support for this measure, and we believe that there is no good reason for it not to appear in the Queen's speech, albeit we've been waiting longer for the next Queen's speech than anyone has since the English Civil War, but surely it is about to happen, and we need to see that legislation introduced as soon as possible. I think this could be a real disruptor, because it will essentially mean that there is a kind of micro-registry of Jersey companies that is a public registry here in the United Kingdom, because actually there are quite a lot of Jersey companies amongst the 87,000 foreign companies that own property here in the United Kingdom. And the same is true for other jurisdictions which keep appearing in these reports. The British Virgin Islands, for example, that is still dead against opening up their company register to the public in the way that the amendment to the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act requires. We'll find that there's a whole chunk of British Virgin Islands companies who are having to declare their beneficial ownership for the purpose of that register. So I think it's really important in terms of where next on this agenda. We'd previously found over £4.4 billion worth of suspicious wealth invested in UK real estate. That's relying entirely on open source information, on information that has come available through the major leaks, the Panama Papers and so forth. And so that's surely just the tip of the iceberg. This could be groundbreaking if we finally get it. Obviously, the registers that Margaret's been talking about and that we are campaigning for them to be really useful, they need to be free to use, they need to publish information in an open data format in a manner which enables those, whether they are investigative journalists, civil society, or indeed law enforcement agencies around the world, to be able to analyze that data rather than the current arrangements, which basically require law enforcement to have already investigated their case, already have found the guilty suspect and their assets, and simply ask for this information as a means of providing the sort of evidence trail which would help them bring a case to court. So nowhere to hide. I gather you've been talking in the tax context about professional enablers this afternoon. That is the focus of our concern, that these criminals should have no one to help them. The police often describe our financial services sector as the first line of defense against money laundering. And, if it really was a first line of defense in a kind of military sense, it would be getting a whole lot more attention. And we're trying to give it a lot more attention, and we've got a report which we're hoping to bring out soon, which looks at the patterns of professional service providers that appear on the fringes of some of the well-known money laundering scandals, whether it's signing off company accounts or working on company formation. But the supervision of the private sector in mounting these money laundering defences, which is a regulatory responsibility, is the weak link here. Now, some of this is done by public bodies, the likes of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and some of it is done, actually, by private bodies, by professional bodies. And eventually, we managed to get the government, through recent legislation, to create a unit which is hosted in the Financial Conduct Authority to supervise these supervisors, to report on whether this system of supervising the companies that are meant to be our first line of defense against money laundering is actually working. The organization is called the Office for Professional Body Anti-Money Laundering Supervision. And they published earlier this year a dynamite report which gives the full authority of a government regulator behind many of the objections that we've had to the weaknesses of this supervisory system. So our concerns have been about conflicts of interest in these supervisors, about their lack of transparency, and about the inadequacy of the sanctions which are imposed. So here's one juicy statistic for you from that report. 92% of accountancy professional body supervisors express concerns, this is to OPBAS, about taking robust action if this would damage their ability to attract or retain members. So we've got membership bodies here in these professional services who are concerned about their revenue and their status and their market share in relation to that function if they fulfill their responsibilities properly as supervisors under our anti-money laundering regulations. It is a terrible conflict of interest, and in speaking candidly to this new unit within the Financial Conduct Authority, pretty consistently across that group, they've fessed up to this conflict of interest, making it difficult for them to commit to fulfilling this important role. So if this is our first line of defense, we've got a problem here. We need to address these problems with supervision. There are two things that we want to see. We want to see a renewed effort from HMRC. At the Treasury Select Committee, I think it was last year, John Thompson more or less held his hands up when challenged about the role of HMRC as a anti-money laundering supervisor, recognised it was not their core role, and suggested that in the context of the spending review, if government wanted to have a conversation with them about someone else doing it, well then, that's an open question. Now instead, government has since gone back to them and said, you can raise your fees a lot more, so you can't complain about not having the resources to do it, now get on and do it. Well, we need to see some renewed effort there. But the other thing we need from OPBAS, this Professional Body Anti-Money Laundering Supervision Office, is to set out the basis on which they will remove this supervisor role from professional bodies that are simply not up to the job. They've got the evidence, they've produced the damning evidence that there's a problem here. There now needs to be some proper policy response. I'm running short of time, so I'm going to have to quickly skip through my third point, which is what we in Transparency International call no impunity, not getting away with it. And the problem we have with corporates when it comes to economic crime is that in this country, it is impossibly difficult to prosecute large corporate actors in relation to economic crime. And therefore, we need corporate liability reform. We have a system in this country where there is a Victorian principle of a controlling mind. You cannot prosecute the corporate unless you can demonstrate that the controlling mind of that, these days now very large and complex entity, knew what was happening. Now this creates a completely perverse incentive for these corporates in terms of their corporate governance to insulate their boards from knowledge about misconduct, to enable them to have this defense or to enable it to be much harder to prosecute them for the wrongdoing that is happening. That is a totally broken system. The government itself committed to consult on a failure to prevent offence for economic crime, which would be to use the alternative model that we have in the Bribery Act. It's been over 2 years since a call for evidence that they've failed to respond to. This was a commitment made at the London Anti-Corruption Summit, and it's one of the few commitments from that summit from the United Kingdom government that they have yet to deliver on. So whether it is having nowhere to hide or no one to help, or no chance of getting away with it. We need to work on these fundamental weaknesses in the way we run our economy that mean that the UK continues to have this £100 billion a year money laundering problem. Undoubtedly, measures have been put in place and they represent a good start. But in terms of ensuring their effectiveness, there is much work to do.
Thank you very much, Anna, Margaret, and Duncan. So we've covered, through those three very lucid presentations, quite a few of the aspects of the system whereby corruption is facilitated at a global level, and the type of vehicles used, such as golden visas and anonymous companies, and some of the people who facilitate it, the enablers. I'm not going to do a further summing up because I don't think it's necessary. The presentations are really clear, and I suspect that the audience is familiar with this. And I'm keen to get into the questions. Before we jump into what's on the screen, is there anyone who really wants to raise a question who isn't able to use this Slido system?
I find that really difficult.
No?
Because there's so many.
Okay, brilliant. So we can jump straight in and use what we've got on the screen, and thank you all for being so diligent in sticking up there some fairly pithy questions and then voting them up. So the first one, we're going to go to... Sorry? I think we were going to go for that approach if people were going to ask questions from the floor. But seeing as nobody wants to, I'm hoping that we can save that 5 minutes to give the panelists a chance to respond to the questions we've got on the screen. So we're going to go to Margaret first with a really excellent, quite specific question, which is what you think can be done to limit the power and influence of the big four accountancy firms on policy.
Sorry, I think I find it weird. I'd much rather have an interaction with people. I'm sure this is brilliant, but it's a bit weird way of doing these questions. So, I think Duncan has sort of talked a little bit in the last bit of his presentation what should be done. There's obvious things that you've got to separate audit from advice, which I think is now probably on the cards, and quality of audit has been really questionable. KPMG and Carillion, if you look at one example of where that has been up for question. So to separate that, I think we have to look. One of the things that we looked at when I was doing the Public Accounts Committee. If you look at all the government advisory bodies on all these issues, they're absolutely chock-a-block full of people from the Big Four and people from the industry. And there's nobody, the only academics tend to be, I'm afraid, rather right-wing academics on this area. There's no left-wing academics. I don't know if Sol's allowed. Are you on any of them? Sol might be. Are you on any of them? No. But you look at there are one or two academics, they're not enough, so there's a very limited range of academics from whom they take their people. And then the final thing is you've got to have people from civil society on there, represent people who care about tax and the issues on that. Any other area of government policy development would have a far more representative bunch of people. This is entirely controlled, and we came across endless examples of where people from the Big Four went in, advised government on how to do the technical rules around a tax scheme, and then came out having created the loopholes to then advise their clients on how to exploit the loopholes. It was scandalous.
Sorry, when you call them in front of the Public Accounts Committee, is there a conflict of interest question there? Because I've seen academics appear in front of these committees who are themselves consultants to the Big Four, but there is no, and obviously they've been put there because of that, but there must have been no conflict of interest.
Well, the only thing I would say is what absolutely shocked me about there was their propensity to be really economical with the truth. So some of you might remember the Luxembourg leaks, where it was absolutely, there was somebody from PricewaterhouseCoopers had leaked a whole dossier of information which demonstrated that they were aggressively mass marketing a tax avoidance scheme out of Luxembourg, out of a deal they did with the Luxembourg authorities. And the head of tax absolutely sat in front of us and totally denied that he was involved in mass marketing a scheme. And all I can tell you is I think he was lying. So it's even in the select committee environment, it's very, very difficult. You know, there's a sort of impunity really about telling the truth. And I think then the other things that Duncan talked about, which was greater transparency, proper liability, and toughening up the regulatory bodies. All our regulatory bodies are deeply under-resourced and don't have sufficient powers.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Duncan, I was wondering if you could take a couple of these popular questions glued together. So the rather hefty one of, are we winning the fight against corruption? And perhaps as a subset of that, is transparency sufficient?
Okay. We aren't winning. We're winning battles. We're definitely winning battles. It's really motivating. My team are very excited about the impact that we have working with friends and useful platforms to try and change things for the better. But we're not winning the war. And I think that's about a whole load of much bigger issues around the rule of law, around what is an emerging acceptance on the international scene that, you know, if you have scale, economic clout, sheer brass neck, then there's not much the rest of the world can do about it. And we've been sliding back for some time from confidence in the ability to establish a rules-based and sustain a rules-based system. And I think increasingly, if you just look at the slide in the Visegrad countries in Europe, even inside the European Union, there have been enough role models for disregarding this sort of thing that more and more are seeking to do so. And so that is a problem for us, definitely a problem. As to whether transparency is enough, no, I don't think it's enough on its own. We need enforcement, but we also need cultural change. We need the kind of collective action that changes what is tolerated in a society, in an economy. And that requires business, yes, government, certainly, but without a doubt civil society, about people that can, in society, own different standards about how we operate. So in the context of money laundering, I think of that in terms of challenging the attitudes that some people have, that money is just money. There's no such thing as dirty money, they will say. It's just money, it's just cash. And yet, if we were talking about jewellery that had been stolen from a jeweller's and that had been passed on cheap to someone who was going to be selling it in some market, knocked off at discounted prices, people would have no trouble at all understanding that the people doing that were handling stolen goods. And that is a criminal offence. And it's not jewellery, it's just jewellery. There's no such thing as stolen goods in terms of jewellery. Well, I think the same is true when huge amounts of wealth are stolen from people's own country's natural assets, from their own state banks, in the case of the first unexplained wealth order and the Azerbaijani state bank. So there is a cultural debate, there's a cultural conversation to take place that rejects some of these assumptions which are the basis for which there is this impunity. And so absolutely, there's more than just transparency to solving this problem. But transparency helps drive a lot of this out of a kind of accepted space for commerce. And the harder you make it to engage in these kind of activities, the harder it is to hide. One of the reasons London's got such a big problem is that there is so much financial transactions going through London. It's a really attractive place to hide trying to move dirty money around as well. So by creating economic spaces where it's hard to deal in dirty money, which is, I think, the contribution that transparency brings, we can make it harder to focus on where the problem actually is.
Mike, I just want to add a little bit of an optimistic note. When I started this, really briefly, when I started this work, 7 or 8, whenever it was, 2011, 2010, 2011, it was considered cool. It was actually considered cool to avoid tax. And I think that's changed. And I think that's down to a lot of the work that you guys have been doing, again, together with us. So, now there's a growing sort of feeling of corporate social responsibility, that paying your tax is part of your corporate social responsibility. And I think the conversation in the boardrooms is beginning to alter. Far enough? No. Fast enough? No. But let's, in the world of trying to achieve what are just fundamental changes, let's actually recognize that we are having some impact.
Thanks, Margaret. I'm going to make myself slightly unpopular by cherry-picking the questions which speak more directly to the themes which were raised by the presenters in their opening remarks. So I'm going to put one to Anna, which is about golden visas. And that's this question: what is the solution to the golden visa issue? Is one solution to shift the competence of citizenship from member states to EU? Is there another approach? And what about impunity for the enablers of golden visa schemes? Just to add a bit on.
The Commission report is weak in solutions, although they point out to the possibility that there would be infringement procedures, namely in terms of state aid. The European Parliament report on tax-free is much more forthcoming and actually calls for abolition, gradual abolition of these schemes. But nothing is going to work if indeed we don't work to expose the dirty deals, the corruption and the crimes, tax crimes and money laundering that is behind it. That requires a lot of work by civil society. We can't really, and by this I would like to go behind golden visas. We can't fight this we have to work a lot, much more, to make it not cool at all, as Margaret was saying. And yes, we see this happening, but still a long way to go. And I believe that indeed impunity, no impunity is crucial. And new impunity, by the way, is not just putting people in jail. That's crucial. We need justice systems that act. But it's actually also confiscation, seizing of assets. Nothing. I mean, many of the corrupt people in Portugal, they would go to prison for 5 years or so, and then keep all the money that they have stolen. We're seeing that. So, seizing of assets, and we have legislation at the European level already, namely based on, because, we are seeing organized crime, and actually presenting it in terms of organized crime. This is organized crime. Sorry, the Big Four are practicing organized crime, if they do it in an organized way to avoid aggressively taxation and so on. And I think we need as well to make the connection. We, in civil society, we need to make the connection with security. Look at our governments. All the time talking about terrorism and so on, to put in question basic freedoms. But here we're talking security. Fighting organized crime is talking security. It's talking security when you're fighting kleptocracies. There are, of course, stealing the proceeds of public resources in other countries. And it's also about justice and equality. We have to be much more effective in terms of the narrative. Absolutely. Making the connection between taxation, anti-money laundering, and fighting corruption and security, namely fighting terrorism, is crucial. Nobody talks about the VAT. Isn't that outrageous? You know that the Commission came out to the conclusion that the carousel fraud in VAT deviates something like 50 billion per year into organized crime, including not just mafia, but Daesh and Al-Qaeda. And yet our governments were not able to pass a proposal that the Commission made to actually prevent that. I'm sorry to say, I have to say this here with this audience. I mean, Singapore-on-Thames is already here. We don't need Brexit for Singapore-on-Thames. Singapore-on-Thames is already here. And by the way, I mean, I always say the father of tax havens might be the US, but the mother is the UK. Sorry. I mean, look at all these little tax havens that popped up, I mean, from Madeira in my own country. Huh? Mostly they were British imports. In the Isle of Man, we went there last autumn, and there were 4 billion, in about 10% of the deposits in the Isle of Man, 4 billion, were belonging to less than 2,000 residents in my own country, Portugal. Probably many of them were not Portuguese. Some could be Portuguese. So, of course, when we were discussing the fourth anti-money laundering, the big campaigner against including trusts was Timothy Kirkhope.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. And it was, of course, anything was used, privacy and so on. We managed to put trusts, somehow started to put it in the fifth anti-money laundering, which is still not yet enacted. Crucial thing is indeed monitoring how the implementation is going to happen. And if the civil society doesn't get better at indeed normalizing this in the narrative, we won't be successful. Transparency is crucial, but it's not enough. We have to make this case, and of course it has to do with security, tax justice functioning, and indeed no impunity.
Yeah, we're going to go to a question which is proving pretty popular here, and we're going to put it to Margaret. So, Margaret, Crown Dependencies appear to have committed not to introduce public registers for 2024 at the earliest, but have got media plaudits for the move they've made rhetorically. What can we do to accelerate this? I might augment that by saying, what will you do if it looks like they're dragging their feet?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You know, this is a really difficult judgment that we're in the middle of making. So if we can get them to voluntarily move towards public registers of beneficial ownership, that is much better. It's better for all sorts of reasons. It's a much better way forward. But we have got, you know, we've got ifs and buts around it, and we are about to engage in. When Andrew Mitchell and I met them, and the first thing was, if you read the document, some of the documents, it looks, will they have a get-out clause? So, for example, if the rest of Europe doesn't implement it properly, will they say in 22, 23, well, it's not working elsewhere, so we won't bother to do it here? They gave us the three people, representatives. They all assured us, they promised us they would do it by the end of 2023. So you have to make a judgment as to whether you believe that. Second, why can't they bring it forward? Well, they again looked at Europe. They looked to Europe, and there is, I now cannot remember it, but there's a report being published by European Parliament, European Commission at the end of 22? 22? Yeah. 21, 22, I can't remember the dates, but they had phased their implementation around the timetable of the European Parliament and European Commission consideration of how the implementation of both the fourth and fifth money directive was going. So again, we'll question that, and I in fact had a brief conversation with Anna before. We are really desperate, those of us that are working in Parliament, to know how the implementation is going elsewhere in Europe, so that we can challenge if that. And the third thing is about it being open and accessible. So is it and isn't it? So I think, you know, this was a huge step forward. It is a huge step forward. Is it real? I think we have to test it over the coming period, which we will do. And then if we test and are convinced that they really do mean it, then we can choose not to legislate. If we come to the judgment, and we will work with the organisations that we've worked to date to develop that further. But if we come to the judgment that they don't mean it, then we still have the option, because there is a majority in Parliament, of ensuring that we legislate to enforce it. So let's just wait and see. If it's a win, and if they're going to do it voluntarily, that is a huge win for transparency. And I think we should all celebrate that.
So before Margaret, Andrew and their colleagues persuaded the government to accept their amendment to the Sanctions Anti-Money Laundering Bill last year, the focus had been on the overseas territories. And it was only after that point because the constitutional relationship is different between the overseas territories and Crown Dependencies. So it was only after that point that the Crown Dependencies started to feel the heat on this question. And with what they announced the other week, their progress towards company beneficial ownership registers that are public is now in play. I wouldn't say it's won, but it is firmly in play. There are a number of steps that they need to take which could have the effect of just making progress on this subject inevitable. It also means from the statements that they've made that they are no longer arguing the principle here. They are no longer saying, you're barking up the wrong tree, there's no way we're going here. So it's become much more a debate about how and when rather than if. And I think that's a really fundamental breakthrough. And yes, there's plenty of room for backsliding here, and we can't let up the pressure. But it's now a very different kind of conversation. And so whether you interpret it as plaudits or not, I think Margaret, Andrew, and everyone that's been campaigning on this should be celebrating the announcement that was made the other week. But we shouldn't take our eye off the ball either.
Thanks, Duncan. I'll just jump in and echo that. I think it has changed the terms of the debate. I was thinking about this because less than 2 weeks ago I was at a UN Office on Drugs and Crime forum in Oslo talking about ways of tackling grand corruption, which, being the UN, they can't call it grand corruption, so they have to call it corruption involving vast quantities of assets, which is a phrase I've learned to master after having it beaten into me over 3 days. And we're talking about this issue of beneficial ownership and whether this group of esteemed experts could recommend that public registers become a global norm. And I was quite surprised to find that my main ally in sort of making the case was HSBC. And the people I was having to argue against were the US government, the World Bank Stolen Assets Recovery Initiative, and a fellow NGO, which I won't name to spare their blushes, although I don't think they're here. And what was quite interesting was that the Stolen Assets Recovery Initiative, who I really think ought to know better, were holding forth with this argument against public registers by saying, we don't need this because there is an existing and better model, and that's the Jersey model. And because we'd been tipped off that something was afoot, and I'd been told to keep my mouth shut, but I couldn't, so I sort of yelled back across the room, are you sure there's still going to be proponents of that model next time we meet? So I think it really has changed the conversation. The implementation is extremely important, and if there's foot dragging, it will affect progress elsewhere, but I think it's a big step forward. And I'm speaking as somebody's half Manx, half my family from the Isle of Man, so I follow this quite closely. So we haven't got a lot of time left, but I think what I'd like to do is actually ask each of the panelists to very quickly have a stab at this rather huge question of the implications of a no-deal Brexit. Could it lead to deregulation and repercussions for transparency? Perhaps useful to think about what could be done to stop that. Now mention Brexit, and I think in any context you risk sort of sucking the oxygen out of any sort of discussion, social or professional. So we would ask the panelists to sort of just speak to it with a sort of keen eye on the issues we're discussing here. But do you have a take on this? Is the prospect of a no-deal Brexit precipitating deregulation and perhaps begetting more money laundering? Is that alarmist? If it's not, what do we do about it? Margaret, do you want to go first?
Well, interesting enough, I haven't thought about it in the context of of no deal, but I have thought about it in the context just of Brexit. And I think, despite even what Jeremy Hunt has been saying, about cutting corporation tax rates, I just don't think it'll happen. And I'll tell you, the reasons are we still will need to do a trade deal with the Europeans. And the Europeans, I hope, will have enough common sense, to put into that trade deal all sorts of provisos around how we behave around tax and corruption before they'll sign off on the trade deal. So our need for the trade deal, because we will need to have that, we will need that, I think is the first thing that will stop it. Will we play around with tax rates in the way that Jeremy Hunter suggested? I just don't think we will. There is no appetite in the UK for raising basic rates of tax or income tax. There's absolutely no appetite. There's absolutely ginormous pressure on public expenditure right across the piece, whether you look at anything from health to education through to student fees, student loans. They're going to have student fees and student loans. They're going to have to do something about that massively expensive thing before the next general election. And I think you've got that pressure on public expenditure and a lack of acceptance in British society that you can raise tax rate. I think the way that you can fiddle around is limited. So I don't believe Jeremy Hunt on corporation tax.
Okay.
And I think because we need a deal, at the end of the day, the Europeans will make sure, actually, in the terms of that deal, that we don't go down the road of deregulation and Singapore of Europe.
Thank you. Duncan, very briefly.
Yeah, so firstly, already, Brexit has been all-consuming for Parliament and government, and we've experienced some consequences from that. I've mentioned the property register legislation is over a year late already. The action on corporate liability is, we've been waiting for a government position for over 2 years now. So there is a problem for government and Parliament doing any number of good things, whilst this all-consuming crisis is the focus of all energy. But there are some potential ways in which we can still win this debate in the context of Britain after Brexit. I frame this in terms of a choice between global Britain, as they like to call it, being a beacon or a buccaneer in the world economy. And whilst you will be able to find some politicians argue for this kind of buccaneering kind of spirit, worth looking up buccaneer. I mean, these were basically, state-legitimized pirates. But while some think that should be the identity for Britain after Brexit, there are still many people who are determined to make Brexit happen in our politics, who don't support that model for the future of this country, who do think that there is merit in national self-interest, if no other reason, in seeking to establish Britain and its traditions in terms of rule of law and so forth as a beacon in the world. This argument was put quite well in the context of trying to secure trade agreements by the outgoing Prime Minister on her tour of Africa last year, where in seeking to extol the virtues of doing business in the future with British businesses, she boasted of the strong rule of law and enforcement of the rules on British businesses in a way that is not the case in all countries in the world. And so through seeking to get these trade agreements, Britain is going to have a job to do to make Britain an attractive place from whose companies to do business with. And I think there remains all to play for to persuade policymakers that the only way they can begin to make a success of this new situation is by choosing beacon and not buccaneer.
Anna, the final word is yours if you want it. Very short, because I think we're being cut off.
Well, I believe that I believe that I don't know what's going to happen if Brexit goes ahead, but but there's a lot of concern indeed that the temptation to go rogue by Britain is obvious, and the genes, in a way, so to say, the practice is already there. That might lead either Europe to, go sink, race in a race to the bottom, even worse than it is. So it's not the rule of law and all the rest, or might indeed bring the EU to get its act together, and that could mean really implementing not capital controls, but taxation in financial transactions. There's a number of countries, as you know, that started some years ago talking. They have not yet enacted it, financial transaction tax, and that there is talk of course, the CCC, more than talk. There's a commission proposal on CCCTB, common definition of the corporate base for taxation, and even of a minimum corporate taxation in the EU. And of course, this together with making the best of the UBO's register, the CBCR, and so on. That's the positive way, so to say. Don't forget that the EU is also creating an EPPO, European Prosecutor, to actually focus on European funds. But of course, the tendency would be that this would have tremendous implications on what member states are doing as well in this with implications. So I don't know which way we're going to go if indeed Brexit happens, but the two possibilities are there. I just would like to call your attention. We are not focusing at all on other areas that are already major sources of money laundering and tax evasion and organized crime and capture of government in the EU, of governance in European countries. And of course, they have financial implications, but they go behind it. And I'm talking free ports. We talk about free ports in the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, but we just talk. Nothing really done. And, of course, other activities such as football and sports events and the way this is, I mean, the transfers of players that are going on. This is an area that represents something like 3% of European GDP, totally out of any control or any pretense of supervision. And what is going on is really outrageous, and I'm coming from a country, Portugal, where the main whistleblower of football leagues is in jail, despite the fact that he was a major provider of crucial elements to fight corruption, tax crimes, and tax evasion and organized criminality throughout Europe.
Thank you. Right, I'd like to thank you all for your excellent questions and such proficient use of Slido, which spared my blushes. I was worried I was going to have to wrangle that myself. And I'd like to thank our three excellent panelists, Dame Margaret Hodge, Duncan Hames, and Ana Gomez, still an MEP for a few more hours. Thank you.